Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin. We're going to be learning is Kiddushin daf lamed zayin. There's a study guide for today, so you can follow along. Also, if you're watching on the YouTube, I'll be sharing my screen. Okay. Today's daf is sponsored by Heather Stone in loving memory of her grandmother, Rose Rachel Leah Bat Aharon Begolda. She taught me to light Shabbat candles, and whose mother brass candlesticks I use. We will now get started with our Mishnah. So starting with the Mishnah at the bottom of Lamed Vav Amud Bet, the Mishnah says, Kol mitzvah shehi tluya ba'aretz, eina noheget ela ba'aretz. She'eina tluya ba'aretz, noheget bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. This is a Mishnah that it's very obvious to us what they mean, because we know this term called mitzvot hatzluyot ba'aretz, which means all sorts of mitzvot that are dependent on work in the land. Those are specifically in Israel. And other mitzvot that are not connected to the land are outside of Israel. What's funny about this Mishnah is we actually understand what the Mishnah means, but the Gemara is going to actually question it and say, what exactly do you mean by tluya ba'aretz? Right? Often there's something that the Mishnah is not clear, and we're also unclear what it means. In this case, we actually know this term, and it's much more familiar to us. But in any case, we're going to go through. So we have mitzvot that are connected to the land. Those are connected specifically to the land of Israel. And therefore, if you're outside of Israel, you don't have to do them. Like, for example, Truma to Masra, taking tithes, you don't have to do that in Israel. And Einat Tluya Ba'aretz, but things that aren't dependent on the land are Bein Ba'aretz, Bein B'chutz La'aretz, right? It's the classic example, by the way, when someone comes on Aliyah. This just happened. I was talking to a new family, and they had no idea that they had fruit trees in their backyard, and they had to take Truma to Masra because, they've been living a purely, religious life all their life, and they've never had to do these mitzvot because they never lived in the land. So there's some things that are only mitzvot in the land. So you might live outside the land and never, ever come in contact with those mitzvot. So now, chutz min, here come the exceptions. Chutz min orla v'kilayim. Orla and kilayim. Orla is the first 3 years you're not allowed to eat fruits that grow on your tree. And kilayim is mixing, right? Usually it's a vine, let's say, with something growing in the ground, with, let's say, a grain. That's forbidden to mix different types. Those are actually forbidden even outside the land of Israel. Those are exceptions to the rule. Okay, why they're exceptions to the rule? We'll see that the Gemara says, halacha l'mosh misinai. Halacha l'mosh misinai means, or they're going to call it a hilchata gemir alei, which basically is synonymous with halacha l'mosh misinai, which is another way of saying a very old tradition. Okay, meaning it's not in the written Torah, but it's a very old oral tradition, whether it was definitely passed down to Moshe at Sinai, or it means it was as if, because it goes way back, as opposed to all sorts of oral traditions that developed closer to the time of when the Mishnah, or sometime in between the time that the Torah was given and the Mishnah was written. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, af chadash, also chadash. What is chadash? Chadash is that until you bring the korban omer, which is brought the day after the first day of Pesach, so the day that after you bring it's a sacrifice from the new grains of that year, you can't eat the grains from the previous year. You can't eat, you can't, the opposite. You can only, I said that wrong. You can't eat grains from the new year until you bring this sacrifice of the Omer. And then that permits all the chadash, all the new crop. That issue, the chadash, the new crop, is forbidden until the 16th of Nisan, and until the sacrifice is brought, is actually applicable according to Rabbi Eliezer. At least the way we're going to understand Rabbi Eliezer right now is even chadash is also outside of Israel. We're going to have to see why he says this, and in fact, is this really what he says? We're going to see maybe there's two ways to understand Rabbi Eliezer. So now the Gemara starts off and asks the question that I said they're going to ask, which is, "My tluya, my she'ena tluya." What does tluya mean, and how do we know that something is tluya ba'aretz? So the obvious way, not what I said, because what I said is what we're used to knowing, which is really the answer of the Gemara, which is we just know, probably based on this Gemara and the way we've been brought up, Tluya ba'aretz means it's dependent on the land itself. But the more obvious way would be, a lot of times in the Torah says, and when God brings you into the land, vayah ki yaviacha, or vayah ki tavo, or vayah, right? Either when God brings you into the land, or when you come to the land, and there's all these mitzvot that are prefaced by those words. And that's going to really be a lot of what we're going to talk about today, the language used by the Torah. So, dependent on what? Means dependent on getting into the land, which is, right, if if you get into the land, right? If it says, when you get into the land, you should do this, that would be kind of obvious that maybe that only applies in the land of Israel. They didn't do it until they got into the land. So that would mean it depended on the land. And she'ena tluya is any mitzvah deluktiv babia, where it doesn't say, and when God brings you into the land. Okay, if you want examples, we're going to see them in a second. Baharei tefillin upeter chamor. Now we're going to say, well, tefillin, okay, and peter chamor, redeeming the firstborn donkey, tichtiv ben bia. It says bia. Okay, we're going to see this right now. Second, what did I just do? I did the wrong share screen. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so now tefillin upeter chamor. Okay, I'm on the study guide, the fourth section. Okay, we'll see. We'll go back to the others soon. Okay, by the way, for example, Orla also says ki tavo el haaretz. Okay, Chadash says ki tavo el haaretz, and now we're saying there are exceptions to the rule, so that's also not going to work. Tefillin and Peter Chamor says by Hayaki v'yacha Hashem al eretz haknani, and when God brings you to the land that kasher nishba lecha ol avotecha, that He promised your forefathers, and unitana lach, and gave to you. You should take all the firstborns of the animals. It also says kol b'chor adam pidyon ben, and then it says at the end, and this will be a sign for you, okay, which means, right, the tefillin that there you have the totafot beinenecha that we were talking about the other day about the bein ha'inai. So now they say, if that's the case, it's not true that those are dependent on the land. People wear tefillin, obviously, outside of Israel. Okay, also pidyon ben we do outside of Israel. So it can't be that that's it. So again, let's read it inside. It says when you get to the land, and yet they're everywhere. So that's not the term that's going to determine if it says when you get into the land, you should do this. That doesn't mean it's tluya ba'aretz. So Amar Rav Yehuda hachi kamar. This is what it means to say, and this is what we kind of knew from the beginning, which is kol mitzvah shi chovat haguf. If it's a chova on the individual, not having to do with the land, no heget ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz. So any mitzvah that has to do with an obligation to a person that's not connected with the land, then it's no heget ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz. Chovat karka, but if it has to do with some sort of obligation on the land connected to the land, okay, like for example, taking tithes, leket, shicha, pe'ah, all those things, leaving stuff for the poor people, the corner of your land, what you forgot when you were reaping. All of those are connected to the land. They're only obligations of the land. Shemitah, right? All those things, just in the land of Israel. Minane, where do we get this from? So now we're going to quote a pasuk. Okay, we can again look at the study guide. First section I put on the sheet is Devarim chapter 12. Eila hachukim v'hamishpatim asher tishmerum la'asot ba'aretz asher natan Hashem Elokei avotecha lecha. So these are the, okay, we'll say chukim and mishpatim in a minute. We'll see what's the difference between them, but basically different kinds of laws that you should observe to do in the land, notice, that God gave you, that God gave your forefathers, lecha l'rishta, for you to inherit, kol hayamim asher atem chayim al adama. All the days that you are living on, now here's a tricky word, on the land. Now, usually when it means the land of Israel, it calls it Aretz. Adama is usually a much more general term, like Adam came from the Adama. It really means like all the days that you're living on this earth. Okay, and that's what we're going to darshan soon, that on the one hand, it says these are laws you're going to keep in the land. But then it says all the days that you live on earth, which sounds like forever and everywhere. And then, just because they're going to add this later, I'm going to read the continuation. The next pasuk in chapter 12 of Sefer Devarim says, "Abed ta'abdun et kol hamakomot asher avdu sham hagoyim." Destroy all the places where the Gentiles were worshiping their idols. Asher atem yorshim otam, when you inherit them, et Elohehem al ha'arim haramim al hagvaot v'tachal kol eitz ra'anan, everywhere that you find where they worshipped idols, destroy their mizbachot, right? Break everything and destroy them and get rid of all signs of idols. Now, that is actually a little tricky because it's also, there's a special law to do that specifically in Israel, but it happens to be applicable everywhere because we have to uproot avodah zarah. It's part of our, right, where our Judaism is against idol worship, and therefore when there's idols, you're supposed to destroy them. So now they say, so where do we get this from? Ditanu Rabbanan. So what we want to know is, how do we know that there's laws that are specifically dependent on the land, and that it's the ones that are on the land itself and not ones that are on the person, not connected to land, right, that are specifically in Israel, and things that are not connected to the land and their obligations on the person are going to be even outside of Israel. So now we're going to darshan this pasuk. Some of the drashot are not really connected, but we're going to darshan the whole pasuk. Ela chukim, elu hamidrashot. What are chukim? They're mitzvot that are learned out by drashot of the rabbis on the pasukim, meaning they're not explicitly in the Torah, but they're darshaned out from the Torah. Hamishpatim, elu hadinim. Mishpatim are the laws that are explicit in the Torah. Asher tishmerun, zo mishnah. Okay. What does tishmerun? Observe. This is mishnah. This means, most of the commentaries say this means learn Torah. What does that have to do with observe? Well, if you wanted a pitch for why, even though we just learned that women are not obligated in Torah study, why perhaps women should be obligated in Torah study, is because this explanation, this drasha is, in order to observe the mitzvot, you have to understand them. Without understanding them, it's harder to observe them. So therefore, right, you can say that women, especially nowadays, that like to understand things, right? Those days, maybe they weren't busy, they weren't intellectually oriented, and they were fine, doing their household duties and keeping mitzvot. But nowadays, in order to do mitzvot, you'll do them much better if you understand them properly. And even in those days, probably the same, but it was just not so doable that women would be learning. But nowadays, Asher Tishmon Zo Mishnah, this would be a good pitch for why women should learn Torah, that learning helps you to observe the mitzvot. La'asot Zo Ma'aseh. So Asher Tishmon, to observe, to do, this means do the actions, right? In other words, again, it's the learning that brings you to the ma'aseh, to the doing. Ba'aretz, now here comes the part that's important for our purposes, for this Gemara. Ba'aretz, yachol kol mitzvot kulam lo yunogod ela ba'aretz. Well, this is like an introductory to mitzvot in general, chukim, mishpatim, all different kinds of mitzvot. And it says you do them in the land, so maybe only in the land. Well, Talmud Lomar, well, that's why the pasuk ends with kol hayamim asher atem chayim al adama, which they understand to mean all the days that you're living on earth. But then now we have a bit of a tricky part. It's hard to understand this. Kol hayamim, if it's all the days, yachol yuhu noagim, bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. We're going to do the seesaw back between the first part of the pasuk and the second part of the pasuk. Okay, so you said all the days, then why does it say ba'aretz? Doesn't make any sense. So they say, right, and then you might have thought, kol hayamim, you would have thought, yuhu noagim bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. Well, kol hayamim sounds like all the days on planet Earth, meaning even outside of Israel. But then Talmud Lomar ba'aretz, on the other hand, back to the seesaw, but it says only in the land. So, well, since the pasuk is confusing us, right? It's like saying which way to go, and it says, and they go that way, right? And point in both directions. So same thing here, right? We've got ba'aretz, we've got like all the days are on the Adama. So, well, riba katuvu mi'et, it made a general statement about Adama, but then it's and kol hayamim, all the days, and then it had a specific thing about being ba'aretz. Well, how are we going to figure out which one's right? Look at the context. This is something we do all the time, right? We take, not just in Torah, but in general, right? You have to look at things in the context. Well, what's the next pasuk? Abei tabdun, destroy all the places. Abei tabdun kol hamakomot asher avdushan. This, by the way, is called in the 13 midot that the Torah is addressed by him, that Rabbi Yishmael listed. One of them is davar halamed mi'inyano, which is exactly this. We're going to learn it from within its context, and that will help us figure out what it is. So this idea of wiping out avodah zarah is actually across the board, even though it's a little bit tricky, because it is, as we said, there's something a little bit more unique about it to be doing it in Israel, but it does happen to be something that's universal, and therefore, af kol shi chovat haguf noheget bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So what typifies avodah zarah? First of all, it's bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, and more so, it's an obligation on the person. It has nothing to do with something that has to be done to the land. It doesn't have to do with the land. So therefore, that's how we come to define which types of things are done bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, all across the board. There are things that are obligations on the person that don't have to do specifically with land. Okay, whereas things that have to do with planting in the land and things like that are all going to be, other than the exceptions that we saw and that we will see, are all going to be only in the land of Israel. So that's the drasha. Now we're going to go back to the Mishnah and try to understand the Mishnah, the end of the Mishnah. We had two exceptions, chutz min ha'orla v'hakilayim, and then we have Rabbi Eliezer who said even chadash. So that those are things that are connected to the land, and yet all we did so far was define what does it mean to luya ba'aretz, and what's the source for that? That it has to do with obligation on the land versus obligation on the person, which is not connected with the land. So now they say, chutz min ha'orla v'hakilayim, ibaylu. Now they ask a question they really want to know about Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, lekula palig or lechumra palig? Is he being lenient or stringent? Lenient would be, chadash is only in Israel, because that's lenient, because you're saying it's not an issue outside of Israel. Strict would be, more stringent would be, chadash, af chadash is in addition to orla and kilayim, that they're exceptions to the rule, that they're also noheg, they're customary to do them, or they're obligated to deal with them outside of Israel. So now we want to know which one. So now, why would you think, right, we kind of explained the Mishnah saying lechumra. So why would you think it's the kula? So we're going to explain both options. Is it lechumra palig? And this is how to read the Mishnah. Hachi kamar Tanakama. Tanakama says, chutz min ha'orla u'min ha'kilayim, dihilcheta gemirala. Now I told you the Gemara was going to say this. Orla and kilayim are exceptions according to Tanakama. Why? Because it's halacha l'moshe misinai. It's been passed down to tradition. We just know that that's the case. And there's nothing to say more than that. Even though you would have thought chovat karkehi, right? Those two things are dependent on the land. So you would have thought they're an obligation of the land and therefore only in Israel. Well, there's halacha l'moshe misinai that teaches you otherwise. But according to Tanakama, aval chadash, but the new crop that's forbidden until the omer is sacrificed, ba'aretz im b'chutz la'aretz lo. That clearly is dependent on the land. My taima, why is that? Because Moshav la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva mashma. Now we're going to start getting into how to read these psukim and their different interpretations. So if we look at Chadash, it says, we're in Vayikra chapter 23, verse 10. Ki tavo el haaretz, when you get to the land, asher ani noten lachem, okay, and then you bring the omer, you do the cutting, you bring the omer, the first of what you cut to the kohen. And then you do tnufa. We talked about that yesterday, about the tnufa. Ve'eni feta omer lifnei Hashem. You wave it, okay? And then the last pasuk there in that section, pasuk Yudalid 14, says, V'lechem v'kali v'karmel lo tochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. Don't eat bread or any kind of roasted grains from the new crop. Ad haviachem et korban Elohechem. Chukat olam l'dorotechem. And I forgot to bold this word. B'chol moshvotechem. So you have two phrases here. You have kitavo, when you come to the land, which we already said on its own doesn't necessarily mean it's dependent on the land, because we already saw that it's not always. But you also have b'chol moshvotechem. Now, with this interpretation, the way we're going to understand Tanakama right now is, why is Chadash only in Israel? Because when you have the combination of when you come into the land, and then in all your dwelling places, that's what moshvotechem means. What it means is when you come into the land and you inherit the land and you dwell there. When is that, by the way? That's in year 15 after they conquered the land, because it took them 7 years to conquer the land. It took them another 7 years to settle the land, to divide it up into properties. And what it means is when you have kitavo, when you come to the land, and then it says some sort of word which indicates dwelling there, like moshvotechem, which has to do with dwelling, it's going to mean in all your instead of saying all your dwelling places means everywhere you live, which someone else is going to say that, which means not dependent on the land. But when bi'ah comes together with moshav, what it means is you come to the land and then you settle it. And that's going to be starting from year 15. And then you assume that means in the land of Israel specifically. So that's why Tanakama thinks, that's why I'm going to read it again. My time of moshav la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva mashma. When it says moshav, it means dwelling specifically in the land of Israel after you inherited and started to settle there. And then, Ata Rabbi Eliezer Lemeimar, comes Rabbi Eliezer, and according, this is again, option one of understanding Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah, which is the way we understood it. Av Chadash noheg bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. He says, no, Chadash is all across the board, anywhere you live. Where does he get that from? My taima, Moshav b'chol makom she'atem yoshvim. He understands Moshav the opposite. Moshav means in all your dwelling places. All your dwelling places could be Israel, could be America, could be Canada, could be Australia, could be anywhere you live. So that's what he says. That's option one. Option two, Odilma Lakula pleading. Maybe he's more lenient. And he said, then now we have to understand Tanakama. Now, because Tanakama never made mention of Chadash, so that's why it's strange, this interpretation, but this is the way where they're going to read it. Hachi Kamar Tanakama. So again, same thing. Oil and kilayim are exceptions. Why? Because it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. V'kosha king chadash, and all the more so chadash. In other words, I didn't even need to say it in the Mishnah because it was so obvious. Why is it so obvious? Well, those, we have no reason to think that they'd be outside of Israel, but we have a tradition that tells us this. But Chadash, of course, there's reason to think that it applies across the board to Moshav, because it says Moshav. And what does Moshav mean? Kol makom shatem yoshvim mashma, because Moshav sounds like anywhere you're living. So I didn't even tell you that because it's so clear from the pasuk. Obviously, it's not so clear because there's machloket, but this is a possible way of understanding Tanakama. Don't worry, because the Gemara is going to reject this reading because it is a little bit weird. They wouldn't mention it, but possibly you could think that since those, there was no source for it whatsoever, and yet, right, we're going to do them outside of Israel. Obviously, where there's a source that says anywhere you live, so we're going to assume that means anywhere you live. Va'ata Rabbi Eliezer l'meimar, and comes Rabbi Eliezer and he says, and when he says Afa Chadash, he means Afa Chadash is only in Israel. Okay, different from what Tanakama says. Chadash eino noheg ala ba'aretz, it's only in Israel. De Moshav la'achar Yerushav yeshiva mashma. Because when it says Moshav, what does it mean? He holds the opposite now, according to this reading. He's going to say Moshav. Basically, we have two ways of reading Moshav. Does Moshav mean specifically when you settle in the land of Israel, or does Moshav mean any of your places where you're going to settle? So he thinks in this reading that it's la'achar Yerushav yeshiva mashma. That it means in the land of Israel after you've conquered and settled. Umay af. So why does it say even Chadash? Even what? What's the even relating to? In other words, we thought in the first reading, even is very obvious. Tanakama says there's two exceptions, and he says even there's a third exception. Now, in this case, he doesn't think it's an exception. He thinks Chadash is part of the original categorization. So afa kamaita. Af means even Chadash is in the original, right, the beginning of the Mishnah. Any mitzvah that's tluya ba'aretz, even Chadash is considered tluya ba'aretz, as opposed to Tanakama who thought it wasn't. Again, it doesn't say this in the Mishnah, but it is a possible reading. To which the Gemara is going to prove that the first reading is right, and Rabbi Eliezer really is strict, and Rabbi Eliezer really holds that when it says Moshav, it means anywhere you live. How are we going to know this? Because of something Abaye said. Tashma, let's learn it from what Abaye said, and we're going to have to learn another braita to explain. Da'amar Abaye. Man Tana de Palagale to Rabbi Eliezer. Which Tana disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer? Comes Abaye and he explains Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael is the Tana who disagrees with the Bright, and to disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer. And to prove this, he's going to bring a Bright, Ditanya, as it says in the following Bright. Lilamdecha shekol makom shne'emar bo moshav eino ela la'achar Yerushav yeshiva. We're going to have a basic machloket Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva. This is very simple, really, which is what words, right? What does moshav mean? Rabbi Yishmael is going to say one thing, Rabbi Akiva is going to say the other. Since Abaye said that Rabbi Eliezer, the Tana that disagrees with him is Rabbi Yishmael, then we're going to know Rabbi Eliezer holding this machloket. Is Moshav everywhere, or is Moshav only in Israel? So whatever Rabbi Akiva says, we're going to get to whatever Rabbi Yishmael says, we're going to assume Rabbi Eliezer says the opposite, because that's what Abaye just told us. So now let's see the opinions. So Rabbi Yishmael, here's the first opinion. Anywhere it says Moshav, Eino Ela La'achar Yerushav Yeshiva. When it says Moshav, it means after you settle in the land, after you conquer and settle. So that's going to mean that Moshav means only in Israel, which means that when Rabbi Eliezer says Afa Chadash, and there it says Moshav, he must mean it means everywhere, because he disagrees with Rabbi Yishmael, and that's basically our answer. But because we mentioned this, we're going to see the other side, and then we're going to have we're going to go off about this Rabbi Yishmael opinion. We'll see. Amar the Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, wait a minute. Every time it says Moshav, it means in the land of Israel only, and after they conquered. Hare Shabbat, Shne'emar bo Moshavot, v'noheget ben ba'aretz ben b'chutz la'aretz. Says, I have a great example that totally breaks your theory. What's that? Shabbat. What about Shabbat? So if you look further down on the sheet, in Shemot, chapter 35, pasuk bet, it says, Sheshi yamim tasem lacha. Okay, very obvious, right? Do work for 6 days. Yom HaShvi'i is Kodesh, Shabbat. Lo tibaru esh b'chom shvatechem b'yom HaShabbat. Don't light a fire in all the places where you dwell on Shabbat. Now, it's obvious to all of us that b'chol moshvotechem means everywhere. It doesn't mean in Israel only. So he says that ruins your theory. Moshav must mean everywhere, according to Rabbi Akiva. Amar le, so Rabbi Yishmael says back to him, don't question me from Shabbat. Shabbat kavachomer atim. Shabbat, there's a different reason. You're right that generally moshvotechem would mean only in Israel, but in this case it means everywhere because of a simple kavachomer. Ma mitzvot kalot noagot bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz, since there's very easy mitzvot that apply in all places. Shabbat chamira lo kol sheken, would it not be obvious? Shabbat, which is so strict, we have very strict, not only are the rules strict, but the punishment is very severe. You're going to get skila if you do it intentionally. So, all the more so, we're going to say, obviously, this applies everywhere. There'd be no reason to think it was limited. So, based on the Kavachomer, you're right, maybe Moshvotechem, it's weird Moshvotechem appears there, Rabbi Yishmael would have to admit, but the Kavachomer teaches us that it's everywhere. So now, they're going to try to figure this out a little bit. So first they say, why did we bring this? Remember, and I already explained this, but we'll explain it again inside. Mida Amar Abaye, man tana de palagale de Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yishmael, since he already told us the one who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer is Rabbi Yishmael, Shma mina Rabbi Eliezer l'chumra palig shma mina. So that was the answer to our question. It's obvious Rabbi Eliezer is more strict. And saying Chadash applies bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz, against Rabbi Yishmael, who said whenever it says Moshav, it means only in Israel. Okay? Now, but then they're going to say the following. Michti Rabbi Yishmael ahechakai. So where was Rabbi Yishmael basing his theory about Moshav? He wasn't using our source, by the way, our pasuk. What he was really, right, our pasuk being the one they were talking about Chadash. He was really using these pasukim in Bamidbar chapter 15. After the Jews have sent the spies, and then they're scared about going to the land. God wants to give them, or at least this is what the commentaries say, that God wants to tell the Jewish people that you're going to come into the land. So the next pasuk is Daber b'nei Yisrael v'amarta lehem ki tavo al eretz moshvotechem asher ani noten lachem. When you get to the land that I'm going to give you, you bring sacrifices, okay, voluntary individual offerings. In Pasuk Dalet, it says, you should bring meal offerings together with that sacrifice. Okay? That's a Pasuk that says, when you get to the land, and it uses the word moshvotechem, and that's what Rabbi Yishmael was basing his theory on, that Pasuk, because that Pasuk makes it very clear that moshvotechem is in the land of Israel, because it goes together with when you get to the land. So the Gemara is going to actually say that raises an issue with what Rabbi Yishmael said. Why? So again, Rabbi Yishmael hechakai, to what was he referring in his proof? On nisachim, he was referring to these nisachim, these extra libations that you bring, the meal offerings that you bring with the sacrifices. But the nisachim, turning out Amabet, bi'avid moshav k'tiv behu. It doesn't just say moshav. In other words, sometimes moshvotechem appears on its own, like in Shabbat, and sometimes moshvotechem appears with bi'ah, as we just saw in the Nisachim. So Rabbi Yishmael was telling us that Moshvotechem, when it comes with Bi'ah, means land of Israel only. But if it doesn't come with Bi'ah, then no. Okay? Meaning, if you just have Moshvotechem by itself, it wouldn't be. So now, I'm going to say Hachi Kamra. This is what he meant to say. L'lamed shekom makom shenemar Bi'ah u'moshav eino ela la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva divrei Rabbi Yishmael. So they correct Rabbi Yishmael and they say, which by the way fits fine with our Minchat HaOmer, also with the Chadash, because in Chadash, what does it say? Ki tavo el haaretz is the first pasuk in pasuk Yud, and then at the end in pasuk Yudalet it says b'chol moshvotechem. So when you have coming to the land with the word moshav, then Rabbi Yishmael thinks kol moshvotechem means in Israel. But if you have moshav by itself, it doesn't mean that. Now there's going to be a problem with the Braita according to this interpretation. What's the problem? Ihachi. Well, the reaction to Rabbi Akiva makes no sense, because the Shabbat pasuk, which said, right, don't light a fire everywhere you live, right, whatever that means. So that doesn't say anything about when you get to the land. There's no section there that talks about when you get to the land of Israel. So now they're going to question and say, Ihachi, if so, Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, Hare Shabbat ne'amar bo moshavot. Right. Number one, Rabbi Akiva questioned him from a place where only Moshav was written. And number two, or building on that, V'amarle, what did Rabbi Yishmael respond? Shabbat kavachomer. Now, if Rabbi Yishmael really held what we just said that he held, which is that it's only when Bia and Moshav come together, then he's got the best retort for Rabbi Akiva. All he has to say is, it doesn't say Bia there, and that's why Moshav there means right everywhere. So Nema le'ana, he should say to him, he should have said to him, V'nema le, he should have said to him, Ana Bia Moshav kamina. He should have said to Rabbi Akiva, it's not really a problem that Rabbi Akiva misunderstood him, but he should have said to Rabbi Akiva, you misunderstood me. I meant Bia and Moshav. Okay, and therefore, if Rabbi Yishmael really holds only when Bia, coming to the land, is mentioned and Moshav in the same section, then we say it means the land of Israel. And you're quoting me something that just says Moshav. Of course it means everywhere in the world, but that's because it doesn't say Bia. But that's not what Rabbi Yishmael says. To which the Gemara answers, an interesting answer, kind of typical Gemara answer, which is Chada v'od ka'amar, which is, he really did say that. But the Braita just mentioned the second one. What he said is, I have two claims against you. Chada, which maybe is obvious and didn't need to be said, I don't know, or maybe it just got lost from the Braita when they were transmitting it orally. But right, we always said the Braitos were always transmitted orally, so sometimes things fall off. Things get lost in the repetition. So Chada da'ana bi'al Moshav kamina. Number one, his first claim, which doesn't appear in the Braita, but imagine that it appears in the Braita, is I really meant Bia and Moshav together, not Moshav when it's by itself. Ve'od, t'kamar tarei Shabbat, ne'amar bo Moshavot, Shabbat kavachomer. And if you're going to specifically point out the Shabbat one, well, I'm going to tell you there I even have an extra claim, which is there also it's a kavachomer, and it's obvious from a kavachomer argument that it would apply everywhere. Okay, so let's just review so far what we did so we don't get lost. We asked, is Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah, does he say, okay, after we brought a source, after we explained what is a mitzvah to ba'aretz, we brought a source for it that shows it's the difference between an obligation on the person or obligation on the land. Then we said, what about Orla and Kilayim and this Rabbi Eliezer who said Chadash? So Orla and Kilayim halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Does Rabbi Eliezer disagree with Tanakh? Does he, he disagrees obviously. But does Tanakama actually think Chadash also is an exception to the rule, and Rabbi Eliezer thinks it isn't? Or does Tanakama, who didn't mention Chadash, doesn't think Chadash is an exception to the rule, and Rabbi Eliezer thinks it's an exception to the rule that's obligated even outside of Israel? And the answer is, since Abai brought this Braita with Rabbi Yishmael and told us also that Rabbi Yishmael disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer, it becomes clear that since Rabbi Yishmael says Moshav, and now we already corrected, say Moshav and Bia, mean Israel only, then Rabbi Eliezer must think Moshav and Bia do not mean Israel only, okay? Because Bia must mean coming to the land, but as soon as you say Moshav, it means everywhere, anywhere you live. And that's how we understand that Rabbi Eliezer must think Chadash is asur across the board. And then we just redefined Rabbi Yishmael that it can't possibly be only Moshav. He must mean Bia and Moshav, and then we had to reread the Braita a little bit to understand that. Now we're going to talk about what really is the root of their machloket, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, about whether Bia and Moshav mean, and these which they learned from the Nisachim. Okay, again, let's just pull up the section for a minute about these extra things you bring with your sacrifice, the meal offering. So it says, Ki tavo el eretz moshvotechem. Okay, when you get to the land that I will give you, and then it says, right, you'll bring these Nisachim. So b'may kamiflik, the root of their machloket is actually a machloket about the reality in the desert. When the Jews were living in the desert, which is when this is happening, this commandment is given to them, and it's saying when you get to the land. So it sounds from the simple reading that this issue of an individual bringing these nisachim, these libations with their sacrifice is only when you get to the land. But we just saw that some people think not, right? So why? So b'kirbu nechasim b'midbar kamiflage. The question is, when they were in the desert, when an individual brought a sacrifice, did they bring it with this extra meal offering or not? So that's the root of the debate, because Rabbi Yishmael savar lo kirbu nesachim b'midbar. And therefore, when the Pesach says, when you get to the land, then you're going to bring these nisachim. But now you're not doing them, only when you get to the land. And therefore, Rabbi Yishmael says, this clearly is dependent on the land. And that's why they're not doing them in the desert. Rabbi Akiva savar kirvu nisachim b'midbar. Rabbi Akiva held that they did do these already in the desert. So then what's this when you get to the land coming to tell you? So we're going to say, right, when you get to the land, what it's saying is it'll be a little different maybe when you get to the land, but you already are doing them now. And therefore, when you get to the land, what it really means is this is something, everywhere you're going to be doing this because you're already doing it in the desert. Okay, and then I just want to see one thing. Right. Right. Rashi says that there was like a particular thing that was changed, that they would only do it on a bamat yachid versus a bamat tzibur. I'm not going to get into the details, but according to Rabbi Akiva, there would have to be, and I'm not going to read your Rashi because it's one interpretation. There's different interpretations. It's adding something, but it doesn't come to mean this is not for now. This is for all times. Okay, just there might be something that's a little different when you get to the land. Okay, but therefore, he says that it's not really telling you that this is something that's only in the land of Israel. So now, Amar Rabbi, Hi Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, so what we have now so far, again, this last section was to set up what was the root of the debate, and it was all rooted in the debate of what exactly transpired in the desert, which nobody really knows, right? It was passed down by tradition maybe, but there was obviously a debate about what actually happened and therefore how to understand this pasuk. So now comes Abai, and he tells us, until now, what we said is Abai said that Rabbi Yishmael is the one who disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer, and that's how we got to what Rabbi Eliezer holds, that Rabbi Eliezer really holds. Chadash is across the board because Chomosh V'Techem means everywhere. And Rabbi Yishmael is the one who said Chomosh V'Techem means specifically in Israel, as long as it comes together with Bi'ah, that we corrected it. So Bi'ah, Moshav, Israel. But now Abai is going to say, Hi Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael, Mapik Me'idach Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael. He says, by the way, we said this is Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. I want you to know there's a different bright in the name of Rabbi Yishmael that says the opposite. Okay, so we now not only do we have machlok at Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael, and also right Rabbi Eliezer's sides on Rabbi Akiva's side. Even there's debate within the Amoraim or Tanaim, or we don't know who, about probably Tanaim even, of what Rabbi Yishmael said, because we're going to have two Tanaitic sources. One we saw already, and a different one that's going to say Rabbi Yishmael says the opposite. So let's read it right now. The Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael, and if you look on the study guide on the second page, the top of the page, I charted out the differences, and now we're going to have a bit of a ping pong between the two approaches. So the first Rabbi Yishmael, and then the Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael that we're going to bring now. The Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael. So the second bright is on the second side of the chart. Ho'il v'ne'emru bi'ot b'torah stam, u'perei l'cha katuv be'echad mehen, la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva. Okay, let's start explaining what all that means. The Torah says, as I mentioned earlier in the daf, in the Shiur, the Torah says many times when you get to the land. It's a big intro section to many, it's a big intro phrase to many, many mitzvot. Okay, you can look on the first side of the page, right? We've gone through a whole bunch of them where it says when you get to land, when you get to land, when you get to the land, when God brings you to the land, etc. Well, in the king, when we are commanded to put up a king, in Dvarim Yud Zayin, in Parshat Shoftim, okay, verse 14. It says, Ki tavo al haaretz asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, v'yirishta v'yashavta ba. When you get to the land, and you inherit it, and you settle in it. Now remember, what did Rabbi Yishmael say the first case? What does tavo mean? What does moshvotechem? Moshvotechem means when you inherit and settle. Well, comes this bright and says the opposite. Since lots of times it says, Ki tavo al haaretz, but in only one of them, although we're going to see it's actually two, but right now we're going to say in only one of them, this is the only place, right now we'll assume the only place, where it specifically says, and you will inherit and you will settle. So that seems to mean, now, when it says something one time in the Torah, what does that generally mean? It means this is a paradigm for everywhere. So since one time it mentions, kitavo, when you come and you settle and dwell, af kol achar Yerusha v'yeshiva. This is going to mean every time it says ki tavo, it's going to mean after you dwell. Now, why does this disagree with Rabbi Yishmael? Rabbi Yishmael said only when it says bi'ah and moshav does it mean that there was settling, that it's after you settle and inherit, and meaning only in the land. But this Rabbi Yishmael, this version of what he said, is that ki tavo, just having coming into the land, means only in Israel and after you settle and dwell. Okay? So now, v'idach, the first Rabbi Yishmael who doesn't think that, who thinks moshvotechem means settle, but not just ki tavo by itself. Mishum dahave, what is he going to say? Well, there's melech ubikurim or shnei ktuvim habeim ke'echad. We keep going back to this, right? It's mentioned twice, not just once. If it was once, it would build a paradigm, but it's actually mentioned twice. Because in Bikurim, when you bring the first fruits, it says ki tavo ala haaretz, and then it says v'yirashta v'yashavta ba at the end of that pasuk. So since it's mentioned twice, what do we learn from here? This means only in these two cases and not anywhere else. So that's what the other Rabbi Yishmael is going to say. And then again, only if it says moshvotechem does it mean yirashta v'yashavta ba. But if it just says ki tavo, it doesn't mean that. So now they're going to say v'idach. So now we're going to go back and forth. So what does the first one say then? Not the first one, the one we just brought. The Braita that said it says it only once. Why is he ignoring the Bikurim pasuk? So here, if you look at the chart, we're going to see Sricha. Okay, so now we're here. That he thinks that Melech teaches you paradigm to the whole Torah. And now the question is, what about Bikurim? So the answer is going to be Tzriche. It's needed. Remember, it's not considered Sheikh Tuvim if each one is necessary. Why is it necessary? Well, why is each one necessary? In which case, you can learn a paradigm from the whole thing. If it's a king and it didn't say first fruits, you would have thought that just by melech you wait, but not by bikurim, because bikurim, what does it mean? It means your first fruits. Let's say you get into the land. You didn't wait the first 14 years and you already have some land you're settling in. Maybe you need to bring your first fruits already because you're already benefiting. So bring them to the temple. And don't wait till year 15. Well, king would be more obvious. If you only said it by bikurim, after you settle, then the obligation kicks in, and you didn't say it by king, you would say, oh, when it comes to the king, of course we need a king right away. How on earth are we going to go to war without having a king in charge of us? So maybe the king would have to happen right away. V'idach. Okay, now back to Rabbi Yishmael, the first Rabbi Yishmael, who doesn't think, he thinks it's shnei ktuvim and that they're not each necessary. So what will he say? Nichtav Rachmana Melech v'lo bai bikurim. We're now here. He would say, you can write Melech and not bikurim. Va'ana amina, I would have thought, Uma Melech de lechabesh lachar Yerusha v'yeshiva bikurim lo kol sheken. I would think that the king is much a stronger claim that we should have this immediately because we need to conquer. We need a king. And yet we still have to wait. So obviously, Bikurim, we're going to wait. And that's why it's not necessary to bring Bikurim. One was enough. And therefore, why did it say two? Two to say two and no more. V'idach, final part of this ping pong. What would the second Braita say? If it just said king, achala kamashmana. The mitzvah of challah, which goes to the Kohen, right? You take challah out of your dough, give to the Kohen. That actually was immediately when they got into the land. And you would think that if it just said it by king, you wouldn't have thought it was by Bikurim because you would think Bikurim are like challah, that it applies right away. So therefore you needed both, and therefore again they were necessary, and therefore you can't say Shnei Ktuvim Habeim Ke'echad Ein Melamdim, and therefore you could learn from them to build a paradigm. So we now saw two opinions about Rabbi Yishmael. Is it Yerusha and Yeshiva is only if it says Bi'ah with Yerusha? Is anytime it says Ki Tavo means Yerusha v'Yeshiva because of the paradigm built from the king and the Bikurim really, but really it's just the king or the king and the Bikurim together because each was necessary and therefore they build a paradigm? Or is Ki Tavo in general not something dependent on the land? That's the other Rabbi Yishmael, unless it says Moshvotechem. Bi'ah with Moshvotechem, that's what teaches you that you have to settle the land first, and then it would be dependent on the land. Now they say, V'hashta da'amrat. Now we're going to go through a whole list of other places. Hashta da'amrat chovat haguf noheget bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz moshav de katav rachmana gabei Shabbat lamali. Now we have to understand what is the word moshav doing in all a bunch of different places. So why does it say moshvo chomoshvotechem and Shabbat? Okay, so if we already know, and if chomoshvotechem teaches you everywhere, but we already learned that anything that's an obligation on the person is everywhere. So why do you need certain places to say b'chomosh v'techem? So the answer by Shabbat, well, the section of Shabbat is written connected with the holidays. You might have thought tibai kiddush ki moadot, that maybe you need to sanctify the Shabbat like the holidays, and maybe only in a place where there's a beit din to sanctify it. And therefore, it teaches Shabbat doesn't need sanctification by a court or anything else, and it doesn't need a place where there's a court to make Shabbat happen. And that's why it's telling you Shabbat applies no matter what, right? 7 days. It's not like the holidays. We have to determine the new moon. Okay, we can open the sheet now, look at the sheet, and look at these psukim. By chelev it says, don't eat the chelev, don't eat the blood of the animals. Now, chelev and dam actually come from the fact that chelev was sacrificed. It's a part of the animal that gets sacrificed on the altar in the peace offerings, that only part of them get offered, right? So it's the chelev, the forbidden fats that are burnt, and the blood gets spilled on the altar. And therefore, we can't eat chelev and dam. Now, it's clearly connected to the sacrifices. So you might have thought, because they're connected with sacrifices, maybe these things are only forbidden when there are sacrifices. And when they're not. And that's why it has to tell you, you should know this applies at all times, not only when there's a temple around. It's actually really by matza. In Shemot, Perek, chapter 12, verses 18 to 20, it says, right, you have to eat matza on the first day, and then it says until the 21st day, all sorts of drashot on that. But the Pasuk 20 says, don't eat chametz, everywhere you live, you have to eat matzah. So why do you need a pasuk for this? It's going to be the same as the previous. Because you might have thought, Salkadat, it's true. You need it. One. Salkadat, al matzot umurim yochluhu, bizmandi kapesach im, bizmandale kapesach lo. Kamashmalan. You might have thought, well, you're supposed to eat matzah and maror together with the sacrifice. So maybe only when there's sacrifices, you have to eat matzah. Maybe when there's no sacrifice, you don't have to eat matzah. That's why it had to tell you, b'chomash v'techem. And now, last one. Let's go back to the one we saw earlier. It talked about in tefillin when you get to the land. Now, we already said tefillin and peterechem are not dependent on the land at all. So why does it say, right, before we were asking, why does it say b'chomash v'techem? This one is, why does it say when you get to the land? It says, we need it for another bright Rabbi Yishmael says, which is, aseh mitzvah zo shebishvila tikanes la'aretz. This was given right after they got out of Egypt. And what they were being told is, do these mitzvot, and God will then bring you into the land as a reward for these mitzvot. And these mitzvot will help you get to the land. And it doesn't mean what it normally means, right? First of all, notice usually Vayakiv is in Sefer Dvarim, and it's kind of later. But this is right when they're getting out of Egypt. And God is saying, I will bring you into the land, but you have to keep this mitzvot in order to get into the land. So he understands that in a totally different way. Okay, so quick review. We'll stop here for today because the next thing starts a question, which the question is even going to end until the next stop. So we'll stop here. So again, we had mitzvot tliyot ba'aretz. What is a mitzvah tliyot ba'aretz? How do we learn it? Where do we learn it from a drasha? That was the Braita. Then we tried to figure out, is Rabbi Eliezer disagreeing l'kula or l'chumra? We said l'chumra in the end. He thinks it's across the board. How do we know? Because of the statement of Abai that said Rabbi Yishmael disagrees with him. When we saw what Rabbi Yishmael said, the Biyah and Moshav, which appear by Chadash, means only in the land. And Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with that and holds by Rabbi Akiva. Then we pointed out that, by the way, right, we had to fine-tune a little Rabbi Yishmael. And then we also said there's a different Braita in the name of Rabbi Yishmael that says something different, which is, right, that Braita said it's specifically, right, anytime it says Biyah, it means not Biyah and Moshav, but just Biyah by itself means only in the land and only once you conquer. And we had to go back and forth, the ping pong. What does the other Rabbi Yishmael hold about that? And then we had to go through, once you know that mitzvot that aren't dependent on the land are everywhere, then why did it say b'chomash v'techem in a whole bunch of places? And what might you have thought had it not said that? Why in those each places you would have thought maybe it's not all the time and in all places? And then we ended with this other thing, which is why it said bi'ah when it came to a mitzvah that didn't have to do with coming into the land. That's it for today. We will pick up from here tomorrow. Wishing everybody a great day.